Hi, boys and girls. Today we're going to read Chapter 3, Bird Woman's River. The winter of 1804-1805 was very cold. At sunrise on January 9th, it was 21 degrees below zero. The next morning, it was 40 degrees below. No wonder the Indians called this time of year frost in the teepee. The people at Fort Mandan tried to stay warm and find food, but the hunters had little luck. Fortunately, Mandan Indians from nearby villages traded corn to the explorers. So the Mandan is the tribe that Charbonneau and Sacagawea are living with right now, and they do live in this and the teepees, and they're trading corn now with the Lewis and Clark explorers. The Mandan also showed the voyagers how they made blue glass beads. Indians called these chief's beads. Tribes in the Northwest used them as money. These beads were also worn in hair decorations, earrings, and necklaces. Sacagawea had a belt of blue beads. It was her prized possession. So here's a little bit about what those blue beads look like. And again, Sacagawea had a belt of blue beads. This is a knife holder, but imagine just this strip of blue all the way around, and then she tied it around her outfit. Early in April, Lewis and Clark sent some men and a barge back to President Jefferson. The boat carried souvenirs for the president. They included a prairie dog, 4 magpies, many newly discovered plants. I didn't know what the plants were, so I didn't have pictures, and an Indian robe. So these are things that got sent to Thomas Jefferson. In the meantime, the men at Fort Mandan were busy. They built new boats so they could continue their long journey to the ocean. The boats were loaded with food and other supplies. On April 7th, the voyagers, including Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Pomp, left Fort Mandan. They rowed up the Missouri River in 6 small canoes and 2 pirogues. Okay, so again, Lewis and Clark started in St. Louis, but they picked up Sacagawea here, and now they're continuing along the Missouri River. And you'll notice that we're getting closer and closer to where Sacagawea's original home was, and closer to where they had migrated to when she was kidnapped. These are the boats that they had. As they paddled west, every traveler but one was leaving home farther behind. Only Bird Woman was heading towards home. For 5 years, she had not seen her family or friends. She had been enslaved, first by the military, then by Charbonneau. Now, thanks to Lewis and Clark, she was heading back to the land of her birth. Would she meet her people there? Were her family and friends still alive? What would they think of her baby? Sometimes Sacagawea rowed in one of the boats. Often she walked along the shore with Clark. Pomp traveled in a cradle board on his mother's back. So this is what the cradle board looked like. And again, it's strapped to her back. And then you can see how just like the face shows. At night, Bird Woman and her family shared a tent with 2 captains and York. Clark came with a large, loving family. He quickly grew fond of Sacagawea and Pomp, and he soon saw that letting Sacagawea come along had been a very wise decision. On their 3rd day out of Fort Mandan, Sacagawea found some very tasty wild artichokes. So this is an artichoke that you might find at like ShopRite or Stop and Shop, but what she found were like flowers or these the leaves above ground, and she got down to the root. She cooked these roots for dinner. Bird Woman found many kinds of plant foods during the expedition. So again, if you or I or Lewis and Clark, who had never been to this area before, saw a flower like this or a plant like this sticking up out of the ground, we wouldn't think twice about digging it up and thinking, oh, this is great, this is food for me. But because Sacagawea is from this area, she's more familiar with the kinds of things that the women in these tribes used to harvest for food, because that was kind of her job. Among the foods that she collected were also currants and gooseberries. Currants are a little similar to raisins before you dry up that fruit, but they're more tart. They're more of a tart berry. 5 weeks later, Sacagawea prevented a disaster. May 14th, 1805 was very foggy. Lewis and Clark were walking along the Missouri River. Bird Woman, with Pomp on her back, was in one of the pirogues. Her husband was steering. Several other men were also in the boat. They were 300 feet from shore. Suddenly, a gust of wind upset the boat. It quickly filled with water. Charbonneau cried out that he couldn't swim. As the other men desperately bailed out the boat, which means they took buckets and things and tried to splash the water out, Sacagawea saw the supplies floating away. Clark wrote in his journal, "A squall of wind struck over sail broadside and turned the pirogue nearly over. The articles which floated out were nearly all caught by Sacagawea. In this pirogue were our papers, instruments, books, medicine, and in short, almost every article necessary to ensure the success of the enterprise." So this is a sketch of Sacagawea as the boat's kind of flipping over and the men are trying to save it. She's reaching out and starting to save some of the supplies that are floating away. Had she not saved the supplies, the expedition might have had to turn back. The captains wanted to honor Sacagawea, so they named a creek in central Montana for her. This stream we called Bird Woman's River, after our interpreter, the Snake Woman, wrote Lewis. On maps, it is called the Sacagawea River. So imagine, if it weren't for her, they would have had to go back all the way to the beginning to get more supplies, to then head back again if that was even possible. The Missouri River became swifter and clearer as they approached the mountains. Cottonwood and willow trees lined the riverbanks. In the distance, pines and junipers topped the higher land, but higher land also meant colder temperatures. At night, water in the kettles crusted with ice, even though it was late May. So it's like later in the month than the time of year we are now. So this is a kettle. It's just like a big pot. So they had water in it, and it would crust and frost over at night because of how cold it was. Rain and snow made traveling difficult, but there were plenty of deer and buffalo to hunt. The explorers stored the meat in their canoes. The men pulling the loaded canoes had to wade in icy water up to their armpits. So this is a little bit different because these are more modern day canoes, but I wanted to show you what it looks like for a river or a body of water to be iced over. So they had to go through this water. Only these people, it looks like it's hard enough they can stand on. They were up to their armpits in the freezing cold water trying to move their canoes. The ground was also very mucky. Those on the shore had to take off their moccasins. Remember, these are those deer skin on the outside, or buffalo skin on the outside and the fur on the inside, but they're not really that waterproof, so they're walking barefoot in the snow. I can barely even hold snowballs in my hand from the snow very long without being frozen, let alone walking for miles and hours in the snow with my bare feet. Hardly a day passed without problems. Captain Clark and Bird Woman were almost bitten by rattlesnakes. There are other problems, sorry. Almost bitten by rattlesnakes. Mosquitoes stung the men and turned Pomp's little body into a massive red sore, so he had so many bites. One man after another came down with the flu, fevers, and diarrhea. Here's a picture of the men pulling the canoe in the water, and it says they had to pull their boats with cords made of elk hide. Sacagawea began running a fever herself around June 1st. As she grew worse, the captains feared that she would die. They were also afraid that the expedition would fail without her. How would they trade for horses without their Shoshone translator? Without horses, how would they get by across the Bitterroot Mountains? And who would take care of Pomp if the mother died? Clark wrote in his journal on June 16, 1805, "The Indian woman, very bad, and out of her senses." The captains took turn caring for Sacagawea. They gave her tea made of tree bark. They brought her iron-rich water from springs. Not until June 24th did she feel better. That's 23 days later, more than 3 weeks. That's a long time to be sick. By then, the expedition had reached the Great Falls of the Missouri River. These waterfalls dropped 400 feet. The voyagers could not go up the falls in their boats. They had to drag their boats around them. This is called portaging. So here is where they're at now. So they started here with where they got Sacagawea, and now they're at the Great Falls in Montana, and they have to carry their boats up the mountain. And this one actually shows you a better image because they actually used trees, it says. They placed the boats on wheels made from slices of a tree trunk. The men then pushed and pulled the boats across the hard ground. Cactus thorn sliced the bottoms of their feet right through their moccasins. So they walked through the cold snow barefoot, and now they have their moccasins back on, but now they're stepping on cactuses. Grizzly bears sniffed around their camps at night, and Lewis's dog Seaman barked all night long to scare them away. So they didn't sleep well. Then storms hit. The worst storm struck on June 29th. Bird Woman, carrying Pomp, was walking along a dry creek bed. Charbonneau and Clark were with her. As rain began to fall, the group hid under a rock shelf. The shower turned into a downpour. Suddenly, a flash flood roared down the ravine. In seconds, the rushing water was waist high. Pushing Sacagawea and Pomp ahead of him, Clark scrambled up to the steep bluff. Charbonneau pulled Sacagawea up by her hand. They escaped just before the ravine filled with 15 feet of water. Pomp's cradleboard was swept away, but Sacagawea hung on to her baby. So again, here's just a picture to show you how they're reaching through each other, and the water was filling up, and they had to get to the top before they all drowned. Meanwhile, giant hailstones pounded the camp. So this is a hailstone. Ours are much smaller in New Jersey usually, but this is very, very big. Several men were hurt. One man was knocked to the ground 3 times. Captain Lewis reported that the hailstones were as wide as 7 inches. So a dollar bill is about 6 inches long, and these were an inch longer. They bounced 10 feet high after striking the ground. On July 1st, the portage was completed. The falls were now behind them. The men made 2 new canoes, Indian style, burning and scraping the inside of cottonwood trees. The voyagers continued up the Missouri River in their 8 canoes. By late July, the land began to look familiar to Sacagawea. Her excitement grew. After 5 years, she was coming back to her homeland. On July 22nd, they reached a creek. Sacagawea remembered that her people had camped in this very place. Soon after, she showed the men the exact spot where she had been kidnapped. So this is the short distance that they've moved because they've had so much trouble. But this green star is where she was kidnapped and whereabout they're at now. Days passed. There was still no sign of people. The 2 captains grew desperate. They had counted on getting horses and guides from the Shoshone. If not, how would they cross the mountains? To make things worse, the men were exhausted and their food was running low. Sacagawea, however, remained hopeful. When they reached a rock known as Beaver Head, she was sure that the Shoshone must be nearby. On August 1st, the explorers split into 2 groups to look for Sacagawea's tribe. Lewis led a small group by land. Bird Woman and her family stayed with Clark and the rest of the men. They continued on by canoe. And tomorrow we'll read Chapter 4, Coming Home.